let's jump into another deep dive. This time, we're looking ahead, way ahead, to 2035. We've got these, well, I guess you could call them future simulations from the Institute for the Future. And let me tell you, they're wild.
Oh, I know, right? Ministries of Future Affairs. A whole month dedicated to the Global Futures Festival. It's like they took future thinking and cranked it up to 11.
Seriously. And a future literacy movement. It's like they're saying knowing about the future is as essential as, like, reading.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what's so fascinating about these documents. They're not just predicting gadgets and gizmos, but a fundamental shift in how these future societies think and operate.
Okay, so no flying cars, but maybe flying ideas.
Something like that. The sheer amount of emphasis they place on long-term thinking is incredible. It's woven into the very fabric of their culture, the governance, everything.
Okay, I'm intrigued, but I gotta ask, how do they go from big ideas to actual action? These ministries of future affairs, they sound kind of, I don't know, Orwellian, like Big Brother, but for the future.
Oh, I see where you're coming from, but it's not about control. Think of them more like guardians of the future. They're tasked with ensuring the well-being of generations yet to come.
Generations yet to come. That's a pretty heavy responsibility. How do they even begin to wrap their heads around that?
Well, one key tool they use is something called the Generational Covenant. It's a framework that outlines specific rights for future generations.
Rights, like the right to clean air or the right to, like, not inherit a planet on fire.
Exactly. And these rights are linked to concrete obligations for current governments and institutions. So, for example, the right to a stable climate would translate into a legal obligation to invest in renewable energy and sustainable practices.
Whoa, so it's not just vague promises, but actual actionable duties. That's a huge EE step. But I'm guessing not everyone's on board with this whole future-first approach, right? I mean, doesn't it clash with, like, immediate needs and priorities?
You're absolutely right. The scenarios acknowledge that there's pushback, especially from those who argue that it stifles economic growth or places an unfair burden on developing nations.
See, that's what makes this so interesting. It's not some utopian future where everyone's singing Kumbaya. There's still debate, conflict, different perspectives.
Exactly. And that's where this idea of polycentric foresight comes in.
Poly what now?
Polycentric foresight. It's a fancy way of saying that they recognize that no single culture or worldview has all the answers when it comes to the future.
Okay, that makes sense. So instead of a one-size-fits-all approach, they're looking at the future from multiple angles, incorporating different perspectives, different ways of knowing.
Exactly, and they're taking it seriously. One scenario mentions how Brazil integrated traditional ecological knowledge from indigenous communities in the Amazon into their national agricultural policies.
So they're not just paying lip service to diversity. They're actively seeking out and incorporating wisdom from those who have, been doing this long-term thinking thing for centuries.
Precisely. And this respect for indigenous knowledge is central to the Indigenous Futures Program, which seems to be a major global initiative by 2035.
Okay, I'm seeing a pattern here. It's like this future is all about embracing a wider range of perspectives, challenging traditional hierarchies of knowledge.
Absolutely. It's a recognition that the future is too complex, too interconnected to be approached from a single viewpoint.
It's like they're saying, hey, if we're going to tackle these global challenges, we need all hands on deck, all minds engaged.
Exactly. And that's where the Global Futures Festival comes in.
The festival. The month-long extravaganza. Tell me more.
It's more than just a celebration. It's like a giant incubator for future thinking, a platform for showcasing ideas, sparking collaborations, and even influencing policy.
So it's like a World's Fair, but for the future.
Yeah, kind of.
Right.
But instead of showcasing inventions, it's showcasing potential futures, different pathways we could take as a species.
Okay, I'm sold. I need a time machine stat. Seriously, this festival, it's not just for, like, futurists and academics, right?
Not at all. It's designed to be accessible to everyone. Artists, activists, everyday citizens. Anyone who wants to engage with the possibilities of the future.
And from what I'm gathering, they're using every tool in the box to get people thinking about the long term. Art, music, technology, you name it.
It's like they've managed to make future thinking, well, fun.
Okay, I'm definitely getting FOMO over here. But before I book my ticket to 2035, let's talk about the how. How are they actually planning for the future? This whole idea of strategic foresight keeps popping up.
That's right. And by 2035, it's become more than just a buzzword. It's a core competency, like reading or math, taught from a young age.
Wow, future thinking as a core subject. That's wild. But I gotta ask, what does that actually look like?
Well, imagine a world where kids are taught to think in terms of multiple possibilities, to anticipate consequences, to envision alternative paths.
So it's not about predicting the future, but rather equipping people with the mental tools to navigate uncertainty.
Exactly. And this mindset shift seems to have permeated every level of society, from individual decision-making to government policy.
Okay, so it's not just kids learning about the future, it's governments, businesses, everyone using this strategic foresight to make decisions. But how do they actually apply it? Give me a real-world example.
Imagine a government proposing a major infrastructure project. In 2035, they wouldn't just consider the immediate economic benefits, but also the long-term environmental and social impacts.
So they're forced to think beyond their term in office, beyond the next election cycle.
Precisely. It's about aligning decisions with the well-being of both present and future generations. And it seems like this long-term thinking has also permeated the business world.
So companies are also thinking beyond the next quarterly report. What's driving that shift?
It's partly driven by consumer demand. These future citizens are more conscious of the long-term impacts of their choices, so they're demanding products and services that are sustainable and ethically sourced.
It's like a virtuous cycle. Future conscious citizens demanding responsible businesses, which in turn are pushing for future-oriented policies from their governments.
Exactly. And this shift seems to be fueled by a sense of urgency, a recognition that the choices we make today will have a profound impact on the world of tomorrow.
Okay, this is painting a pretty compelling picture of a future where people are taking responsibility for shaping their destiny. But I gotta wonder, with all this emphasis on planning and analyzing potential outcomes, is there any room left for spontaneity? Just going with the flow.
That's a great question, and one that the scenarios themselves grapple with. It seems like there's a balance. While strategic foresight is highly valued, there's also a recognition that the future is inherently uncertain.
So it's not about trying to control every outcome, but rather about developing the resilience and adaptability to navigate whatever comes our way.
Exactly. And that adaptability is crucial, especially given the rapid pace of technological advancement. In fact, AI seems to play a central role in how they approach the future.
Ah, AI. The elephant in the room, or should I say the algorithm in the algorithm. It feels like it's been lurking in the background of our entire conversation. So let's dive into that. How exactly is AI being used to shape the future in these scenarios?
Well, one key application is in augmenting human capabilities when it comes to futures research. Think of AI as a powerful tool for analyzing vast amounts of data, identifying emerging trends, and building complex scenarios.
So it's like having a superpowered research assistant that can help us make sense of the overwhelming complexity of the future.
Precisely. But it's not about replacing human judgment or intuition. The ultimate goal is to democratize knowledge about the future, making these insights and tools accessible to everyone.
Ah, so AI is being used to empower individuals and communities to participate in shaping their own futures. That's a much more hopeful vision than the AI takes over the world narrative we often hear.
Absolutely. And that's reflected in the rise of something called the Open Futures movement, which advocates for free and open access to AI-powered foresight tools and research data.
Okay, that's a movement I can definitely get behind. But I have a feeling we're just scratching the surface of what AI is capable of in this future world.
Oh, you're absolutely right. There's so much more to explore, from how it's being used to revitalize indigenous knowledge systems to its role in addressing climate change and social inequality. But we'll have to save that for another deep dive.
We've covered a lot of ground already, but it feels like we've only just begun to peek into the fascinating and complex world of 2035.
Exactly. And in our next part, we'll delve deeper into how these societal shifts impact the everyday lives of people, their values, relationships, and even their sense of purpose.
All right, so we've seen that the world of 2035 is like seriously committed to future thinking, right?
Yeah.
But how does all of this actually play out when it comes to governing? Like these ministries of future affairs we keep talking about, are they just for show or are they really shaking things up?
Well, let me tell you, they've pretty much revolutionized the political landscape. It's really quite remarkable how they've managed to actually make future-oriented governance a reality.
Okay, so it's not just a fancy name. They're really changing how governments work. How so?
One striking example is this thing called the long-term impact assessment. It's now like a mandatory process for any major policy decision.
Hold on, mandatory. So like every single new law or policy, they have to think about the long-term consequences.
Yep, that's right. Imagine, a policy proposal lands on a minister's desk, right? Well, in 2035, they wouldn't just be thinking about the immediate political fallout or economic impact. Nope. They'd be legally obligated to assess its potential ripple effects decades, maybe even centuries down the line.
Whoa, that's some serious future-proofing.
Oh,
But how can they even predict that far out? I mean, isn't that kind of impossible?
well, they've got some pretty sophisticated tools to help them out. Like they use these complex AI models and simulations to analyze different scenarios and assess potential outcomes.
Oh, right, AI. Of course. So, like, they're using AI to predict the future.
Not exactly predict, more like explore possibilities and assess risks. The AI helps them to consider a wider range of factors and perspectives, but it's still ultimately humans making the decisions. It's not some AI overlord dictating policy, if that's what you're thinking.
Okay, good, good, because honestly, that was kind of creeping me out for a second. But it makes sense, using AI as a tool to, like, broaden our thinking, right?
Precisely. And this whole approach really ties back into this idea of intergenerational justice, which seems to be at the heart of their political philosophy.
Right, right. Making sure that our actions today don't screw over future generations.
Yeah.
But how do they actually put that into practice? Like, how do you hold someone accountable for something that might not happen for decades?
It's less about traditional enforcement and more about creating a cultural shift. It's about weaving those values into the very fabric of society. And the generational covenant, the one we talked about earlier, well, that's a prime example of how they're doing just that.
Okay, remind me, what was the generational covenant again?
It's basically a framework that outlines specific rights for future generations, and it connects those rights to specific duties for us in the present.
So it's not just about saying, hey, future generations matter. It's about actually giving them rights,
Yeah.
like legally recognized rights.
You got it. For instance, the right to clean water for future generations is linked to a present obligation to invest in water conservation and pollution control. It's about making those future needs actionable in the present.
Hmm. That's pretty cool. But I still can't help but think, isn't it tough to get everyone on board with this? Like, won't some people resist having to make sacrifices today for a future they might not even see?
You're right, it's definitely a challenge, but they've got some interesting strategies in place. Like, many countries have these youth futures councils that advise their ministries of future affairs.
Wait, so young people have a direct say in government policies?
Yep, that's the idea. Who better to represent the needs of the future than those who will actually be living in it, right?
Makes sense. And it sounds like it's not just limited to government, right? You mentioned that businesses are also getting on board with this whole future thinking thing.
Oh, absolutely. The scenarios show a lot of companies are incorporating long-term sustainability and social impact into their decision-making, partly because that's what younger consumers and employees are demanding.
So it's like this bottom-up and top-down pressure, both from citizens and from within institutions, pushing for a more future-oriented approach.
Yeah.
That's pretty powerful. But I got to ask, with all this focus on, policies and economics and all that, what about culture? Like, how does all this future thinking affect art, music, entertainment, the fun stuff?
Ah, that's a great question. And it seems like culture is definitely not immune to this future fever. In fact, there's this whole genre called futures art that's become super popular.
Futures art. Okay, you got to explain that one to me.
Well, it's basically art that actively engages with the future, not just as like a backdrop or a setting, but as the main subject, the thing they're exploring. And it takes all kinds of forms, from traditional paintings and sculptures to immersive VR experiences.
Wow, so it's like art that makes you think about the future, about possibilities, about choices we make today.
Exactly. One of the scenarios describes this movement called speculative design, where artists create these objects or experiences that imagine how future technologies might impact our lives.
Okay, so like instead of just designing a cool new gadget, they're thinking about like the social and ethical implications.
Precisely. Imagine an art exhibit showcasing a prototype for a personal drone, right? But instead of focusing on its cool features and technical specs, the exhibit explores questions like how might personal drones impact privacy or urban planning or even how we interact with each other.
That's deep, way deeper than just, drooling over the latest tech. It's making people actually confront the potential consequences.
Right. And it's not always about doom and gloom either. There's also a lot of futures art that focuses on positive possibilities, like envisioning sustainable cities or exploring how technology can be used to solve global problems.
So it's not just about warning us about the future, it's about inspiring us too, right?
Exactly. And a lot of this futures art is showcased at, you guessed it, the Global Futures Festival.
Ah, the festival.
Hmm.
Always coming back to that. So it's like a giant art exhibit meets future think tank.
It's way more than that. It's like during the festival, entire city districts are transformed into these immersive, interactive experiences. Think futuristic fashion shows, giant VR installations, experimental music performances, you name it.
Okay, color me intrigued.
Uh,
But with all this grand stuff happening, what about the everyday person? Are they just passive spectators in this future world, or are they actively shaping it?
Oh, they're definitely not passive. In fact, the scenarios emphasize the power of collective action and the importance of social movements in driving change.
Okay, that's good to hear. So it's not just governments and big institutions calling the shots.
Not at all. There are tons of examples of grassroots movements pushing for a more equitable and sustainable future. Like there's this global commons stewardship initiative that's really taken off.
Oh yeah, the one focused on protecting shared resources like oceans and the atmosphere, right? We touched on that briefly before.
Yeah, that one. And it's gotten so big by 2035 that it's actually driving the creation of new international governance structures.
Whoa, so they're actually setting up global institutions to manage these shared resources.
That's right. For example, there's a Global Ocean Commission that's responsible for developing and enforcing regulations to protect our oceans from pollution, overfishing, and the effects of climate change.
So instead of each country just doing its own thing, they're coming together to solve a problem that affects everyone.
Exactly. But it's not just top-down regulations. It's really driven by grassroots activism, with millions of people around the world participating in research projects, local initiatives, and advocacy campaigns.
So it's like this global movement of citizens taking responsibility for the planet. That's pretty inspiring.
And it's not just about the environment. There are also movements focused on social justice, economic equality, and the ethical development of AI. All these different groups are working to ensure that the future is equitable and sustainable for everyone.
It's pretty amazing how all these different threads are weaving together. Government policies, technological advancements, cultural expressions, social movements. It's like this incredibly complex tapestry of the future.
You said it. But of course, it's not all sunshine and roses. Even with all the progress and innovation, there are still challenges and potential downsides to navigate.
Okay, let's talk about the downsides. What are some of the things that worry you about this future world?
Well, one concern is the potential for increased social isolation, even with all the emphasis on community and connection. As technology advances and virtual experiences become more immersive, there's a risk that people will retreat into their own little digital bubbles.
Right, right. It's like we're more connected than ever, but also potentially more isolated.
Exactly, and that could have serious consequences for mental health, social cohesion, and even political discourse. And then, of course, there's the challenge of ensuring equitable access to all these technological advancements and opportunities.
Yeah, we've seen how technology can worsen existing inequalities. It's crucial to make sure everyone benefits from these advances, not just the privileged few.
Absolutely. And then there's the whole question of what it even means to be human in a world increasingly shaped by AI and automation.
Whoa, that's a deep one. Like, what happens to our sense of purpose and identity when machines can do so much of what we used to do?
Right. These are some of the big questions that they're grappling with in 2035.
I guess it's a reminder that no matter how advanced we become, there will always be new challenges to face and new dilemmas to solve.
That's the nature of progress, isn't it? It's a constant process of learning, adapting, and evolving.
Okay, well, after all that heavy stuff, I'm ready for a little dose of optimism. Let's talk about that Global Futures Festival one more time. It sounds like the perfect antidote to all this doom and gloom.
It really is a celebration of hope and possibility. It brings together all the themes we've been discussing: future literacy, strategic foresight, global collaboration, the power of collective imagination. It's pretty amazing.
So it's more than just a bunch of academics discussing theories. It's a real cultural event.
Oh, yeah, for sure. It's a month-long, multi-city festival happening all over the world simultaneously. Imagine a whole city district transformed into this giant interactive playground where you can explore potential futures, test drive cutting-edge technologies, and meet people from all walks of life who are passionate about shaping a better tomorrow.
Okay, now I'm really getting FOMO.
Yeah.
What are some of the specific things you can experience at this festival?
Well, there are these interactive exhibits showcasing different future scenarios. Like you could walk through a self-sufficient eco-city or explore a space exploration outpost.
So you can actually step into a vision of the future. That's wild.
It is. And there are also debates and panel discussions with leading thinkers and experts from all over the world, covering everything from climate solutions to the ethics of AI.
It's like a global brainstorming session for the future of humanity.
Right. And then there are policy hackathons where people from different backgrounds collaborate to come up with solutions for pressing global challenges. And often the best ideas are actually adopted by governments and organizations.
So it's not just talking about the future, it's actually creating it, right?
Exactly. And of course, it's not all serious business. There's also tons of art installations, musical performances, futuristic fashion shows, and all sorts of creative expressions that showcase the imaginative potential of humanity.
Okay, now I'm officially bummed that I can't time travel. This festival sounds like something everyone should experience. But before we get too carried away with these grand visions, I want to bring it back down to earth a bit. Like, how does all this translate into the everyday lives of people in 2035?
Well, that's what we'll explore in our final part. We'll dive into how these cultural shifts impact people's values, relationships, and daily routines. It's pretty fascinating stuff.
All right, so we've explored these big ideas, like ministries of future affairs and AI-powered foresight. But now I'm curious about the human side of things. Like, what's it actually like to live in this future world of 2035?
Yeah, that's what I find most fascinating too, how these grand visions actually translate into people's everyday lives. And one of the biggest changes seems to be in how people approach work and leisure.
Okay, so we're not all working ourselves to death in some hyper-efficient, soul-crushing dystopia.
Not exactly. Remember we talked about that 4-day eco week thing where people only work 4 days a week?
Oh, yeah, yeah. To, like, reduce their environmental footprint and have more time for themselves.
Right.
Sign me up.
Well, it seems like that idea really caught on by 2035. A lot of countries have adopted it, and it's had some pretty interesting effects.
Like, wouldn't working less lead to, like, less productivity? Wouldn't the economy just tank?
That's what some people feared, but the scenarios suggest that with advancements in automation and AI, productivity hasn't actually suffered. In fact, some argue that this shift has actually boosted innovation because people have more time and energy to pursue creative endeavors.
So it's not just about working less, it's about, like, working smarter and using that extra time for personal growth, maybe even starting new businesses.
Exactly. And it seems like people are using that extra time to get more involved in their communities too. There's this resurgence of like community gardens, neighborhood skill sharing workshops, local art festivals, all these things that bring people together and strengthen social bonds.
Ah, that's nice. It's like in a world that's increasingly digital and globalized, people are craving that sense of local connection, that feeling of belonging to a community.
Yeah, definitely. And this desire for connection isn't limited to their local communities either. There's also this big emphasis on global citizenship and intercultural exchange.
Oh, like those student exchange programs, but for adults.
Exactly. Imagine professionals swapping jobs with their counterparts in other countries, families hosting visitors from across the globe, retirees embarking on cultural immersion trips.
Wow, that's a great way to break down cultural barriers and like build bridges between different countries. But isn't all that travel bad for the environment?
That's a valid concern, and it seems like they've thought of that too. While physical travel is still popular, there's also been this huge rise in virtual cultural exchange programs thanks to advancements in VR technology.
Oh, wow. So you can experience like the sights and sounds of another culture without ever leaving your living room.
Pretty much. It's all about using technology to connect people across borders and foster a sense of global community. But even with all this focus on the future and all this cool tech, there's still a strong appreciation for, the wisdom and experience of older generations.
Right. Like we can't forget the lessons of the past when we're trying to build a better future.
Exactly. And one of the movements that's really helped to bridge that generational gap is the intergenerational justice movement. Remember we talked about the generational covenant? Well, this movement was a driving force behind its creation and implementation.
So it's not just a legal document, it's like a whole social movement.
Yep. And their impact goes way beyond just policy. They've really challenged how we think about aging and the role of older adults in society. For example, they've created programs that encourage older people to stay active and engaged, and they've pushed for policies that value their skills and experience.
So instead of being like pushed aside, older generations are seen as a valuable resource.
Precisely. And this shift in perspective has led to some interesting innovations in how communities are designed. For example, there are these multi-generational living communities where people of all ages live together, support each other, and learn from each other's experiences.
That's really cool.
Yeah.
Like a whole community that values and supports people at every stage of life. I love that. But it seems like that would require some big changes in how we design our homes and neighborhoods, right?
Oh, absolutely. And the scenarios actually mention how architects and urban planners are starting to think about these things, designing spaces that cater to the needs of diverse age groups and encourage interaction between generations.
Okay, I'm totally rethinking my assumptions about aging and retirement now. But what about education? How are young people being prepared for this future world? I mean, it seems like a lot to keep up with.
Well, that's where these lifelong learning circles come in. They're basically groups of people of all ages who get together to learn from each other's experiences and perspectives.
So it's not just about young people learning from older generations, it's about everyone learning from everyone else.
Exactly. It's this idea that learning is a lifelong process, and it can happen in all sorts of settings, not just in traditional classrooms.
And I'm guessing this whole emphasis on intergenerational learning extends to the workplace too,
Yes.
right? Especially with all the changes brought on by AI and automation.
Oh, absolutely. The workplace of 2035 is vastly different from what we know today. A lot of traditional jobs have disappeared, but new ones have emerged. Jobs that require creativity, critical thinking, adaptability skills that people of all ages can possess and develop.
So it's not just about like young tech wizards taking over the world.
Not at all. In fact, a lot of companies are starting to realize the value of having intergenerational teams, recognizing that each generation brings its own unique strengths and perspectives to the table.
So diversity isn't just about race or gender anymore, it's about age too.
Exactly. And this kind of diversity is leading to some really innovative solutions because these teams can draw on such a wide range of knowledge and experience.
Man, this future is sounding pretty amazing so far. Longer lifespans, a focus on community and well-being, a global perspective, everyone learning and growing together. It's like a utopia. But I know there have to be some downsides, right? I mean, no future is perfect.
You're right. There are definitely challenges and potential pitfalls that the scenarios acknowledge, even though they paint a mostly optimistic picture.
Okay, so let's get real for a second. What are some of the things that worry you about this future world?
Well, one concern is the potential for social isolation. Even with all the emphasis on community and connection, there's still a risk that as technology advances and virtual experiences become more immersive, people might retreat into their own little digital bubbles.
Right. It's like we're more connected than ever, but also potentially more isolated.
Exactly. And that could have some pretty negative effects on mental health, social cohesion, even political discourse. And then there's the challenge of making sure that everyone has equitable access to all these technological advancements and opportunities.
Yeah, that's a big one. We've seen how technology can actually make inequality worse, so it's crucial to make sure that everyone benefits, not just a privileged few.
Absolutely. And then, of course, there's the big question of what it even means to be human in a world where AI and automation are becoming so sophisticated.
Yeah, what happens to our sense of purpose, our sense of identity, when machines can do so much of what we used to do?
Exactly. Those are some of the big philosophical questions that people are wrestling with in 2035.
Wow, I'm starting to get a little existential anxiety here. But I guess that's the nature of thinking about the future, right? It's exciting and inspiring, but it can also be a little daunting.
Definitely. But ultimately, I think it's a worthwhile exercise. Because by exploring different possibilities, both positive and negative, we can start to make more informed choices today that will shape the world of tomorrow.
Well said. This deep dive has been a wild ride for sure. It's given me a lot to think about, both in terms of what we should be striving for and what we need to be cautious of.
It's been a pleasure exploring these possibilities with you, and who knows, maybe some of these seemingly far-fetched ideas will become our reality sooner than we think.
Well, on that note, we've reached the end of our journey into the world of 2035. Thanks for joining us on this adventure, and remember, the future is not something that just happens to us. It's something we create together.